Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from the artist in question. I'm talking about the new album from Dakuan, Memphis Innovation. Okay, so Dakuan is the techno-focused side alias for Darnell Stewart, who primarily performs under the name DJ Dance Alone. Dance Alone, one word. He's released a few projects under that name that I guess were marked as leaning more towards sample-based stuff and vaporwave and that kind of stuff. And he did release one other album as Dakuan called Jadali earlier this year, though I haven't heard any of those myself. I've only heard this project because he personally sent it in to me for a $10 Patreon request. Now, of course, longtime viewers may know that me making a video for an artist who submitted their own album to my Patreon is not a common occurrence. I keep the $10 tier exclusively for obscure Bandcamp artists and the like who just want to hear my feedback on their stuff. And most of them tend not to be much more than, less well-produced versions of other artists. To be fair, it's rare to get one that isn't at least decent, but there haven't been many that I felt like I've wanted to keep around longer term or really stuck out to me as anything special. I'd obviously never heard of this guy before the request was sent in, and while he's not a complete no-name, at least has a decent following on Spotify and SoundCloud and has a fairly professional-looking website, he's still pretty dang obscure and not even the most popular artist who's ever requested on this tier. I didn't have any kind of expectations that he'd stick out to me as anything special going into this. And I sure as hell was not expecting him to be the first artist to ever request on this tier with an album that I consider properly great. So I had a ton of fun with Memphis Innovation. It may not be anything especially innovative, but as far as just straightforward, no-nonsense techno goes, this is some of the best stuff I've heard in this vein all year. There's just so many fantastic danceable grooves all over this thing, and it had me headbanging pretty much from start to finish with no real weak points for me to speak of. And it's not exactly a quick listen. This project runs on for 72 minutes over 12 tracks, and was in serious danger of being a chore to get through, especially since it is a straight techno album that's just as traditionally repetitive as most material in this vein is. But no, I never got bored by the album or felt like this thing was losing my attention at any point. It's just all really freaking good techno. As far as individual tracks go, I will first have to say the opener and title track is one of the less well-developed cuts here, and mostly focuses on the same groove over the course of nearly 9 minutes. It's not the strongest or most attention-grabbing of openers, but I never got sick of that core groove or the bits of repetitive vocal samples that got introduced. And even right on first listen it had me like, oh, this is actually pretty credible, I quite like this. But then the album really picks up when we get to Chapters, which has all these brighter melodic flares and even some big, lo-fi soul singer samples thrown in there for a hint of Burial influence or something. It was really striking right off the bat and had me like, damn, if the rest of the album is this good, I might end up even buying it. And the rest of the album was that good. I got my fair share of lots of grooving retro drum machines, various vocal samples, mostly in the background, really solid synth bass lines, and all these tracks had pretty well-defined identity apart from each other. There were tracks that had more of a melodic and atmospheric edge to them, like the more peaceful feeling of Vacancy that still had banging deep house beats, and the similar driving house-ish tinges of Lyton Withting that had some particularly thick old-school synth bass lines. There was kind of a glitchy IDM interlude in Onward. There were the airy pads and bright vocal chops of the most atmospheric cut of all, Luvs and Dreams. Again, gave me mild Burial vibes. Though I think of the cuts here that nailed the Burial vibe the best, it would have to be Downstairs. The way that one, pitch down reverb-covered sample went over the banging beat and submerges itself and all those lush synth pads, it was freaking awesome. But of course we get our fair share of more hard-hitting bangers too. My favorite of those is probably Slaw Flodge, because of how hard its bass lines go. Also gotta give a shout to the best titled track here, Fuck Clint Eastwood, which stands out for sounding the most like an old Detroit techno cut. Getting some Jeff Mills or Terrence Dixon kind of vibes out of the melodies on that one. Meanwhile, you also got a cut like The Diaspora, which may not have felt as tuneful as some of these others, but still has loads of dark acid sequences, punchy gang vocals on the offbeats, and quite a bit of progression and changing up over time. I technically picked this one as my least favorite, but even this was a really good track too. Picking a least favorite was really difficult. I was wondering whether some of those much longer cuts near the end would be candidates for that spot, but they weren't either. Firefights does take a minute to really get going, but once that super intense synth bass comes in, I'm just sold on this one till the end of it. There's even a part with some melodic pads that sort of remind me of Pacific State. And the final cut, Black Forest, stretches on for 10 minutes and might be the biggest banger of them all. All the synths and vocal samples have a much harsher and more industrial tone to them, with much less focus on the more melodic tones that would color most of these other tracks. At least until about the 6-minute mark, when all these spooky pads come in to form some more immersive atmosphere, right at the perfect time for those to be introduced. And yeah, that's everything on here, and this thing is just so freaking good across the board. I mean, there are plenty of nitpicks that I could level at this thing, like how a lot of tracks end in like hard cuts that chop off the reverb tails, despite there clearly not being any attempt to make a continuous mix here. And I guess it's not the most stunningly produced or creative take on this genre I've ever heard. Basic Rhythm's Electronic Labyrinth still has this beat out in those particular departments while also being a much tighter listen. But in terms of pure personal enjoyment, they're pretty much on the same level for me, and I might even lean a bit towards this one. This album may not be anything to write home about, like mixing and mastering wise, definitely sounds like a one-man effort and will not knock anyone's socks off. But it's certainly all good sounding enough for what it's going for, and clearly it's doing something right if it kept me this well invested the whole time. And honestly, the more I think about it, the more the slightly more lo-fi production on this thing kind of reminds me of like a guy called Gerald's earlier work. Like this entire album feels like it could have reasonably passed as something that guy would have done, so that's only a compliment. Like I said, most artists who submit on the $10 tier feel like a worse sounding version of their favorite artist, but even if this guy's influences aren't too hard to pin down, he doesn't feel like he's drowning in them or sitting in their shadow. He's even kind of doing new creative ideas with them. The album is still a bit on the long side, and I have a feeling that's going to feel like a commitment for some people, and I would be lying if I said like I felt like those 72 minutes zip by super quick for me, but there was no moment to this album where I felt like it was getting to be too much or like the sound was getting stale. Yeah, I mean, not much else to say. This is one heck of an undiscovered gem, and I can't believe this showed up in my backlog of obscure Bandcamp artists paying for a text post. This guy definitely deserves more attention than he's getting. Definitely hanging on to this, probably even as a solid shot at my year-end list somewhere. This gets a strong 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.